The temperature had dropped to -15 degrees Celsius and the mountain forest had gone completely silent in the way that only happens when winter stops being a season and becomes a sentence, when the cold moves past discomfort and past pain and arrives at something final and absolute, something that does not negotiate and does not apologize and does not leave room for argument. And on this particular night in the high mountain range where the trees grew so thick and so tall that even in summer the light had to fight its way to the ground, the silence was so complete that a man walking through it could hear his own heartbeat, could hear the blood moving in his ears, could hear the specific sound of his own breathing as it left his mouth in pale clouds and vanished upward into the dark above him. And that man was Daniel Cross, 38 years old, former United States Navy SEAL, now resident of a remote mountain cabin that sat 4 kilometers from the nearest road and 14 kilometers from the nearest town, a man who had chosen this isolation not because he was running from something, though some nights it felt exactly that way, but because after everything he had seen and done and survived in the service of his country, the silence of the mountain was the only thing loud enough to drown out everything else, and he had been walking this particular trail for 3 years now, checking the same traps along the same route in the same darkness with the same flashlight and the same wool cap pulled low over the same scarred ears, and he knew every bend in this trail, every route that crossed the path, every place where the ground dipped without warning and every place where the trees opened just enough to let the stars through, and so when something changed on this particular night he felt it before he saw it, felt it in the specific way that 11 years of military service teaches a man to feel things, not with his conscious mind but with the older part of him, the part that sits below language and below thought and simply reads the world as it is and sends up a flare when the world stops matching its own established pattern, and the flare went up the moment his flashlight beam found the paw prints in the snow at the edge of the trail, prints that had not been there that morning when he had walked this same path in the opposite direction, prints that were large and fresh, their edges still crisp and clean and sharp, which meant they had been made within the last 30 minutes before the wind could soften them and smooth them back into the white uniformity of the surrounding snow, and they moved in a straight line through the white in a way that no hunting animal moves, no circling, no doubling back, no pause to investigate or assess, just a direct and purposeful line toward the clearing that Daniel knew lay 40 meters ahead through the last stand of pine trees, and he crouched over the prints with his flashlight held close to the surface and studied them the way he had been trained to study everything, which was completely and without assumptions and without the luxury of deciding in advance what he expected to find, and what he read in those prints was not danger exactly but something stranger than danger, something he did not yet have a word for, a quality of urgency combined with stillness, of speed that had arrived at its destination and stopped completely, and he straightened up and moved toward the clearing, with his eyes moving in the scanning pattern that never fully left him even 3 years out of the service, left and right and low and high and center, left and right and low and high and center, the rhythm of a man who learned through experience that costs you do not want to pay, that the thing which kills you is almost always the thing you stopped watching, and when the trees opened and the clearing appeared before him, he stopped walking entirely because there in the center of it, in the open space where the snow lay flat and pale under the black sky and the cold stars burned above without warmth or comfort, stood a German shepherd, and she was standing absolutely still. She was perhaps 70 pounds, female, with the broad deep chest and the intelligent dark face of a working dog, a dog bred and born and shaped by generations of selection for purpose, for the capacity to focus completely and to act without hesitation and to continue past the point where other animals stop. And she was standing in the center of the clearing with snow accumulating on her back and her ears and along the ridge of her dark muzzle, the snow building on her the way it builds on objects that do not move, on fence posts and fallen logs and the shoulders of stone statues in city squares, building patiently and without malice, simply doing what snow does to things that stay still long enough. And Daniel registered this with the part of his brain that processed anomalies and threat assessments and the gap between what should be and what is, registered the fact that this dog had been here long enough to become part of the landscape, long enough for the storm to begin incorporating her into itself, and still she had not moved, and she was not looking at him standing at the edge of the clearing, she was not looking at the tree line or the sky, She was not looking at anything except the ground directly beneath her front paws, staring at it with the concentrated and total focus of an animal that has reduced its entire existence to a single point, a single task, a single refusal, and Daniel watched her for 10 full seconds from the edge of the clearing before he moved, watched her the way you watch something when you understand that the watching matters, when you understand that what you are seeing is important even before you know why, and then he began to move toward her, slowly, hands open at his sides, footsteps deliberate and careful, making no sudden movements because a dog this focused, a dog this deep inside whatever it was that was keeping her in this clearing in -15 degrees, could interpret sudden movement as threat even from someone who meant nothing but good, and as he moved across the clearing toward her she heard him, those large ears came up, the left one first and then the right, and she turned her head just enough to look at him, just enough for his flashlight beam to find her eyes, and what he saw in those eyes stopped him for the second time in 2 minutes. He had seen exhaustion before in his life, had seen it in many forms and in many faces, had seen it in men who had been awake for 72 consecutive hours in hostile territory with the knowledge that sleeping meant dying, had seen it in men who had given everything they had to give and then been asked and required to give more on top of that, had seen it in the mirror on bad mornings when the mountain felt less like refuge and more like exile, and what he saw in this dog's eyes was that same exhaustion, bone-deep and physical and completely earned, the exhaustion of something that has been holding on past the point where holding on makes any biological sense, past the point where every signal the body sends says stop, rest, lie down, release, and the will has simply overridden all of those signals one after another until overriding them has become the only mode of operation remaining, and alongside the exhaustion there was something else, something that in a human face Daniel would have called relief without hesitation, the specific and complicated relief of someone who has been carrying an impossible weight alone in the dark and has just seen another person appear at the edge of the light. And the combination of those two things in the face of an animal who was so clearly past the limit of what her body should have been able to sustain stopped Daniel cross mid-step in a way that almost nothing had stopped him in a very long time, and he stood there in the snow and looked at her, and she looked back at him for 3 full seconds, long enough for something to pass between them that was not language and not training and not any system of communication that either of them had been taught, just something direct and clear and complete, and then she dropped her gaze back to the ground, back to that single point beneath her paws, and made a sound that Daniel felt in his chest rather than heard with his ears, a low vibration at the base of her throat that was not a growl and not a whine and not any of the standard sounds in a dog's vocabulary but something between all of them, something that existed in the register of pure need and pure communication stripped of everything except the essential message, which was here, look here, this is where everything matters right now, this is the only place in the entire world that means anything in this moment, and Daniel moved the last 10 feet between them without thinking about it, moved on instinct and on the reading of that sound, and crouched in the snow at the edge of where she stood and shone his flashlight at the ground beneath her paws. The first thing he saw was nothing remarkable. Just snow, the same snow that covered everything else in the clearing, and for 1/2 second his mind offered the possibility that he was wrong, that there was nothing here but a lost dog in the cold, and then the snow became different as his eyes adjusted to the angle of the light and his brain processed what his eyes were actually sending it rather than what it expected to receive, and the snow was not flat, it was slightly uneven, slightly compressed in a way that snow is not compressed by its own weight alone or by wind alone, compressed in the specific way that snow is compressed when something is under it, something solid and heavy and shaped wrong for stone, shaped like a person, shaped like a human being lying face up in a shallow depression in the frozen ground with 14 inches of mountain storm packed over them, and then he saw the strap. 1 single inch of dark nylon barely visible at the very edge of the dog's right forepaw. A backpack strap, buried and ice-covered. And almost invisible but there, definitely there, and Daniel's mind completed the equation in less than a second, backpack strap plus compressed snow plus German Shepherd standing motionless in -15 degrees for long enough that the storm has begun to bury her, and the answer to that equation was a human being under this snow right now. A human being who might or might not still be alive but who was certainly not going to remain alive for long if Daniel spent any more of the next few minutes crouching and staring, and he said to the dog, quietly and with great control, the control of someone who has access to panic but is choosing not to use it, he said, "Hey, move back, let me see," and the dog looked at him one more time with those exhausted eyes and then stepped aside, 2 precise steps to the left, and stood watching him with the posture of something that has been carrying a responsibility alone for a very long time and is now, with enormous relief and with an enormous and considered trust, placing it in other hands. Daniel pulled off his glove with his teeth and began to dig with both hands, and what the snow gave up to him as he worked was a story told in layers the way all buried things tell their stories. First the backpack strap and then the pack itself and then the shoulder it was attached to and then the arm below the shoulder and then the hand at the end of the arm, and the hand was dark with cold, the fingers were curled inward and the skin had gone the color of old wax, the color that skin goes when the blood that gives it warmth and color has retreated inward to protect the core, but the fingers were curled, not open, and dead hands open. Daniel knew this, the muscles that hold a grip release when the body releases, and so the fact that these fingers were still curled meant something important, meant the person attached to them had not yet released anything, was still somewhere inside the cold and the dark insisting on existing, and he pressed 2 fingers to the inside of the wrist. And found what he was looking for, found it slow and faint and irregular and far too weak but undeniably present, a pulse, a heartbeat, a human being still making the most fundamental argument available to a living thing, which is simply the argument of continuing, and Daniel exhaled one long breath that came out as a great cloud of vapor in the dark and said, "Okay, I've got you, said it quietly and said it to the snow and to the hand and to whoever was beneath both of them. Said it as both information and promise, and then he dug faster, both hands working in wide sweeping arcs, throwing snow to either side, and the German shepherd dropped to her own front paws and began to dig alongside him without any instruction or invitation, her large paws scraping at the packed snow, her teeth pulling at the edge of the buried pack, working beside Daniel with the natural unself-conscious efficiency of an animal that knows exactly what needs to be done and has been waiting for someone to come and do it with her, and together, the former Navy SEAL and the exhausted German shepherd, they pulled the mountain's secret up into the cold air and the flashlight beam and the breathing dark. What the snow gave up completely after 4 minutes of digging was a man, and his name was Mark Ellis, though Daniel did not know this yet, did not know anything about him yet except what the next few minutes would teach through observation and assessment, which was 30 years old approximately, dark-haired, lean in the build of someone who spends more time in the field than in any gym, wearing a high-quality hiking jacket over what appeared to be good thermal layers over a base layer that had done everything the materials science and the engineering behind it had promised it would do and had simply been overwhelmed by the duration and the severity of what had been asked of it, lying on his back in a shallow natural depression in the frozen ground that the storm had filled completely over the hours he had been there, his lips the pale blue-gray of someone whose body has made the decision to stop sending warmth to the periphery and concentrate everything on the center, his breathing shallow and audible and irregular when Daniel put his ear close enough to hear it, each breath a small wet negotiation between a body that was running out of reasons to continue and a will that had not yet formally agreed to stop, and Daniel put his palm flat on Mark's chest and felt the faint warmth still resident there, the last warmth, diminishing, and calculated without allowing himself to flinch at the calculation that there was perhaps 20 minutes of margin here, perhaps 25, not more than 30, and the cabin was 4 kilometers away through a building storm in -15 degrees with no road and no trail that a vehicle could navigate and no way to call for help because the storm had taken the signal 2 hours ago and the satellite phone was at the cabin, and Daniel Cross had operated in worse situations with worse math and come out the other side of them, and he settled the straps of the sled he was about to build across his shoulders in his mind. Before he had built it yet and began. The emergency thermal blanket came out of his pack first, crackling in the silence of the clearing with a sound that seemed enormous, and he wrapped it around Mark's torso with the quick practiced movements of someone who has done this before, not in these exact circumstances but in circumstances close enough that the hands remember what the mind has to think about, and the German shepherd pressed herself against Mark's side as Daniel worked, her body heat adding itself to the work of the blanket without instruction, And Daniel looked at her once while his hands were busy with the blanket and thought something he did not have words for yet, thought it in the wordless register that some moments occupy, and then he cracked the chemical heat packs from the kit in his pack, one under each of Mark's arms where the axillary arteries ran close to the surface, and unrolled the emergency space sack and worked Mark into it with the careful urgency of someone who knows that every second of warmth retained is a second of margin preserved, and while he worked he talked, not for his own comfort but for Mark's, not knowing how much was getting through the hypothermia to whatever level of consciousness was still operating behind those closed eyes, but knowing that the voice of another person is itself a kind of warmth, is itself a signal that the world has not abandoned you entirely, and he said, "My name is Daniel Cross. I live about 4 kilometers north of here. I'm taking you to my cabin. You're going to be all right. I need you to stay with me if you can. If you can't stay awake, just keep breathing. Just do that one thing. Keep breathing." And Mark's lips moved and the sound that came from between them was barely a sound at all, barely more than an exhalation shaped into syllables, but the syllables were Luna, and Daniel looked at the German shepherd who was now pressed fully against the space sack with her chin resting on Mark's chest, and said to her, "You come too. More than earned that." And she looked at him with those dark exhausted eyes and pressed her nose briefly against Mark's cheek and then looked back at Daniel with an expression that he would spend time thinking about afterward, an expression that communicated something like, "Yes, I know, I was always coming, that was never a question, the only question was when someone else was going to show up and help." He built the sled in 11 minutes. He had built better ones in better conditions and he had built worse ones in conditions that made this night seem mild by comparison, and this one was functional and that was what it needed to be. 2 young pines pulled free of the shallow root system that winter loosened, stripped of their branches with his field knife in fast practice strokes, lashed parallel with the paracord from his pack at 3 points, cross-braced with the stripped branches to create the platform, padded with the emptied contents of his own pack spread flat, and he tested every joint and every lashing before he loaded Mark onto it, because the things you do not test are the things that fail you, and the time to discover a weakness in a construction is before the weight is on it, not after. And when he was satisfied, he rolled Mark onto the sled with the careful deliberateness of someone moving an object that must not be jarred or jolted, and Luna understood the operation without instruction, moving aside when Daniel needed space and pressing close during the pauses to maintain the heat she had been providing, and he secured Mark with 2 lines of paracord across the chest and across the hips, firm enough to hold through rough terrain, loose enough not to add any restriction to the breathing that was already doing the minimum it could sustain. And then he stood up in the clearing in the -15-degree dark and took the paracord harness across his shoulders and leaned into it and felt the weight settle and took the first step north toward the cabin. The first 100 meters were the hardest in the way that the first 100 meters of any long physical effort are always the hardest, the body protesting the demand before it accepts the demand, the muscles complaining before they commit, and the snow in the clearing was deep and unpacked and the sled wanted to catch and drag rather than slide freely, and Daniel leaned into the harness at the angle that put his full weight into each step, his thighs burning with the load, his shoulders taking the pull of the paracord with a steadiness that was trained rather than natural, his breathing shifting from the controlled rhythm of the walk to the working rhythm of real exertion, and Luna moved alongside him and slightly ahead, her paws finding the path through the snow with the sureness of an animal who has navigated this terrain before and whose body carries the knowledge of it in a way that does not require thought or calculation. And Daniel watched the line she chose and followed it in. The moments when the dark and the blowing snow reduced his own visibility to the point where the path was a memory rather than a visible thing, and this cooperation between them, this practical and unsentimental exchange of capacity and trust in the service of the man in the sled, was one of those things that Daniel Cross would find himself returning to in the months that followed, turning it over the way you turn over something that contains more than its surface suggests. The trail climbed for the first kilometer, a steady rise through dense pine that offered some protection from the wind but translated every gained inch of elevation into additional load on the harness, and Daniel moved through the climb with his head down and his breathing controlled and his attention narrowed to the operational question of the immediate 10 feet of trail, because that is how you move through impossible tasks, not by measuring the full distance against your current capacity, which is a calculation that produces despair rather than progress, but by making the next 10 feet happen and then making the 10 feet after that happen and refusing to do any arithmetic that extends beyond the immediate segment. And behind him in the sled, Mark Ellis breathed in the shallow, irregular rhythm of someone whose body has reduced its operation to the essential minimum. And Daniel listened to that breathing the way he had once listened to mission timers, with total attention and a complete preparedness to respond to any change in the pattern. The wind came back at the 1-kilometer mark. It came from the northwest the way it always came in these mountains when a front moved through, not gradually but all at once, as if a door had opened somewhere up in the high peaks and everything held behind it released simultaneously, and the temperature dropped 3 more degrees in the space of a single minute. A drop that Daniel felt in his exposed face and his hands, and the specific way that his lungs processed the incoming air, and the snow that had been falling straight down in the calm before the front began to move sideways, cutting across the trail in shifting white curtains that reduced visibility to 15 feet and then to 10 and then to a moving gray-white wall that Daniel navigated by memory and by following the dark shape of Luna ahead of him, a shape that appeared and disappeared in the blowing snow like something that existed in the space between the visible and the invisible, here and then gone and then here again, always forward, always finding the path, and he followed her with the trust of someone who has run out of better options and discovered that the option remaining is sufficient. He talked to Mark as he pulled the sled through the storm, not continuously but in the periodic language of connection, the check-in signals of someone maintaining a line to another person, saying stay with me and that's it, keep breathing and we're moving and I've got you and nearly there. And whether any of it reached through the hypothermia into whatever level of awareness Mark was maintaining, he had no way to know, but it cost nothing to say and might mean something. And in Daniel's experience, the things that cost nothing and might mean something were always worth the doing, and besides the talking kept his own mind from the calculations it was trying to run in the background, the ones about what the next hour held and what the options were if they ran out before the cabin appeared. And so he kept talking and kept moving and kept listening to the breathing in the sled and kept following the dark shape of Luna through the white. She stopped once, at the halfway point where the trail crossed a frozen stream, stopped so suddenly that Daniel nearly walked into her, and he pulled up short and stood in the blowing snow reading her posture with the quick fluency of someone who has been watching her long enough to understand her vocabulary of movement and stance, reading the forward set of her ears and the raised angle of her head and the direction her nose was pointing, which was not ahead on the trail but off to the left, into the dense trees on the western side, and he stood very still and listened past the wind and heard nothing at first and then heard something, a sound that was distinct from wind and distinct from the creak of tree branches under snow load and distinct from anything that could be produced by the weather, a heavy deliberate crunch of snow being compressed by weight, the sound of something large and purposeful moving through the trees to the west, 50 meters away perhaps, maybe a little more, moving parallel to the trail and then slowing and then stopping, and Daniel stood in the trail with the sled behind him and Luna beside him and the sound of Mark's breathing audible even over the wind, and he felt the old assessment machinery running its cold calculation, felt it arrive at a probability that sat in his chest like a stone, and then the sound in the trees did not resume, and after 30 seconds Luna turned back to the trail and moved forward and Daniel followed her, and whatever had been in the trees remained in the trees, and he filed the information away in the part of his mind that held things requiring later attention and kept moving. The cabin appeared through the driving snow at the 2-hour mark, its single window lit from within by the residual glow of the morning's fire, a yellow rectangle in the white and gray dark that hit Daniel Cross with a force that surprised him, hit him with a relief so physical and so complete that it manifested as something close to pain in his chest. The specific relief of someone who has refused throughout an entire ordeal to calculate the possibility of failure and now discovers that refusal was not denial but prophecy, and he said to Mark in the sled behind him, said it with the steadiness of someone who is allowing himself one moment of something before returning to the work. There it is, we're here, you made it. And to Luna he said nothing because she was already accelerating through the last 30 meters of snow, moving toward the cabin door with her tail moving in a way it had not moved all night, the full broad sweep of a dog who has completed the task that was asked of her and is not too exhausted to feel something about that completion. And Daniel leaned into the harness for the last time and covered the final distance and got the cabin door open and brought Mark Ellis in out of the cold. The floor in front of the wood stove became the operating theater. Daniel fed the fire immediately, stacked it high with the split wood from beside the door, opened the damper completely, and then opened the medical kit that lived under the bunk and that he had kept stocked and current for 3 years against exactly this kind of night. Because the mountain always eventually presents the night that tests whatever preparations you have made, and he had learned this lesson young enough that the preparations were thorough. He checked Mark's core temperature with the thermometer from the kit and the reading was 30.2 degrees Celsius, which was dangerously low, which was the temperature at which organs begin to make decisions that the person attached to them has not authorized. And he began the rewarming protocol with the systematic precision of someone who has trained for this specifically and knows that in this domain improvisation is not creativity but risk, warm dry clothes replacing the wet ones. With the careful technique of passive movement that does not stimulate the cold peripheral blood to return to the core before the core is ready to receive it, warm sweet liquid prepared and standing by for the moment any level of useful consciousness returned, external heat applied only to the core. And Luna pressed against Mark's side and contributed her body heat to the operation without being asked, and Daniel let her stay because she had earned the right beyond any argument and because her warmth was genuinely part of the treatment and because some things you simply do not separate. Mark's eyes opened at 11:15 in the evening. He opened them and looked at the wooden ceiling of the cabin for a long moment with the expression of someone assembling a reality from components that have been scattered and disordered by the hours just past, putting the room back together piece by piece, the stove and the fire and the log walls and the smell of wood smoke and the weight of dry blankets and the warmth that was strange against skin that had forgotten what warmth felt like, and then he turned his head to the left and found Luna, and something in his face changed in a way that Daniel, watching from across the room, understood without being able to describe, something that reorganized itself around the fact of her presence, around the specific fact that she was here and that here meant they had both survived the night, and he raised his still pale right hand and placed it on her head and she pressed into it and closed her eyes briefly and opened them again and the sound she made was quiet and low and complete, the sound of an animal returning to the world it had been defending. When Mark could speak with the reliability of someone whose body temperature has returned to a range that allows the brain to function as it is designed to function, the first full sentence he produced was her name, Luna, said with all the weight of what that name contained on this particular night, said the way you say the name of something that you understand you almost lost, and the second thing he said was thank you to Daniel, and Daniel said you're welcome in the way you say things that are simply true and need no elaboration, and then Mark looked at him with clearing eyes and said, I need to tell you something, I need to tell you why I was up there. And Daniel pulled the chair from beside the small table and sat down across from him and said, take your time. So Mark talked. He talked with the careful deliberateness of someone whose mind is still warming up alongside his body, checking each detail against his memory before committing it to speech, and the story he told across the next 40 minutes covered 3 months of fieldwork in the high mountain range, fieldwork that had begun as a legitimate university research project studying winter wolf pack movement patterns and had become, in its second week, something else entirely when Mark had found the first bait station, a professionally constructed and camouflaged feeding station in a location that made no sense for any legitimate wildlife management purpose but made complete sense as a component of a systematic and sophisticated illegal hunting operation targeting not just the deer and elk that constituted the lower-stakes illegal harvest of the opportunistic poacher but the protected and endangered species that commanded the kind of prices in the international wildlife trafficking market that justified the level of investment and organization Mark was looking at, mountain lions and wolverines and things he had documented but not yet fully identified, and he had spent 3 months building a photographic and evidential record of the operation's infrastructure, bait stations and snare locations and equipment caches and access routes, staying below the radar of whoever was running it, or believing he was staying below the radar, which was not the same thing and which he had discovered was not the same thing approximately 3 weeks ago when he had been photographing a cache site on a gray morning and had heard movement in the trees behind him and had looked up and had seen nothing and had told himself it was deer and had been wrong. Since that morning 3 weeks ago someone had been following him, appearing at the edges of his fieldwork in ways that were never close enough to constitute direct confrontation but were consistent enough to constitute a message, And Mark was a scientist and not a soldier, but he was not naive and he understood the message. And he had accelerated his documentation and begun planning his exit from the field while trying to complete the record, trying to collect the last pieces of evidence that would make the case against the operation not just strong but airtight. And 3 days ago the men he had been aware of as a distant and watching presence had become something closer, had appeared on the trail behind him as he was returning from a documentation run in the late afternoon, not running, not calling out, not doing anything that could be characterized as overtly threatening if witnessed by a third party, just walking fast on the same trail. He was walking fast on with the specific quality of purpose that communicates intent without stating it, and Mark had understood in his body before his mind had fully processed the implications and had left the trail and gone into the trees and begun moving toward lower ground where there were roads and other people and the protection of the world outside the forest. And the storm had come in while he was moving and the visibility had dropped, and he had been moving faster than was safe through terrain he did not know well enough to move that fast through in zero visibility, and the ravine had been invisible under the snow, and one moment there was ground under his boot and the next moment there was not, and he fell. He fell 8 feet into a snow-filled gulch and hit the bottom hard enough to knock the air out of him and lie there gasping in the cold with the snow coming down from above and the cold coming up through the snow below. And Luna had been with him throughout all of it, had been his field companion for 14 months, the best and most reliable colleague he had ever worked alongside in any professional context. He said this without irony and without exaggeration, and she had been on the trail when he ran, and she had been in the trees when he navigated through them, and she had been at the edge of the ravine when he fell, and she had been at the bottom of it with him seconds after he landed, and she had been with him through the hours that followed as the snow came down and his ability to move diminished, and his awareness of the world around him became intermittent and unreliable, and she had not left him, not for an instant, not at any point during the hours between his fall and Daniel's arrival. And Mark said this in the quiet, flat tone of someone stating a fact that is so large it has gone past the capacity of emphasis to contain it, said it as pure information, and then sat with it for a moment in the warm cabin while the fire spoke in the stove and Luna breathed against his leg, and Daniel sat across from him and said nothing because there was nothing useful to add to what had just been said. And then Mark said, "There is something else." His voice changed quality when he said this, became more careful, the way a voice becomes when the information it is carrying has weight beyond the ordinary, and he told Daniel about the sound he had heard 2 nights ago, the night before he was chased, the sound of vehicles on the Forest Service road that ran along the eastern edge of the mountain range, vehicles moving at night without lights, which meant either that the people driving them knew the road well enough to drive it in the dark or that they did not want to be seen. And both of those options pointed in the same direction. And he told Daniel about the conversation he had overheard fragments of 3 days ago at the cache site before he was seen, fragments that included references to a timeline and to the word clean and to a location that corresponded with the coordinates of his own base camp, and the sum of all of it was that the people running this operation knew they had been documented, knew approximately how much documentation existed, and had decided that the cleanest resolution to their exposure problem was not to abandon the operation and disperse but to eliminate the record and the person who had created it, and Mark said this clearly and without drama because the clarity and the absence of drama were the most effective way to communicate the seriousness of it, and then he looked at Daniel and said, "They know I was in this area of the mountain. They will have followed the trail in the storm as far as they could. They may have found where I fell. And they will not stop." Daniel looked at the window. The storm was still going, still pressing at the glass with its white hands, and beyond the storm was the dark, and somewhere in the dark was the track that led to his cabin, the track that was the only vehicle access to this part of the mountain, and he thought about the sound in the trees at the frozen stream, the sound of something large and purposeful that had moved parallel to the trail and then stopped, and he thought about 3 months of professional illegal wildlife trafficking operation and the kind of people who run professional illegal wildlife trafficking operations and what their calculus looks like when they determine that the risk of leaving a witness alive exceeds the risk of removing one, and he set his coffee cup down on the floor beside him with the care of someone whose hands need to be available and went to the window and looked out. Luna raised her head. Her ears moved forward and stiffened. Her eyes went to the window and stayed there with the focused attention of an animal reading a frequency that human senses cannot access directly, and then, through the wind and through the snow and through the darkness that lay beyond the glass, headlights appeared on the track below the cabin, and they were not one set of headlights but two, and they were not moving past but stopped, and the figures that appeared between the vehicles and the cabin when Daniel's eyes adjusted to the light and the distance were 3 in number and moving with the spread and the caution of people who had done things in the dark before and had learned from the doing. Daniel Cross did not panic. He had trained the panic response out of himself so completely over so many years and in so many circumstances that it no longer arose as an available option, had been replaced by something that functioned better under pressure, which was a rapid sequential cascade of assessments and decisions that took 4 seconds to complete and produced a plan, and the plan was simple because the best plans always are, the simplicity of good plans being one of the things that distinguishes people who have actually done difficult things from people who have only imagined doing them. Mark could not be moved. His temperature was still below safe, and moving him back into the cold would undo 2 hours of careful rewarming and almost certainly kill him. So the cabin was the position, and the cabin was what needed to be defended, and Daniel knew his cabin with the intimacy of 3 years of living alone in it, knew every window and every angle and every structural advantage and every weakness, and he went to the locked box under the bunk with the key that lived on the cord around his neck and opened it and took out what he needed with the same calm economy of movement with which he had done everything else on this very long and very cold night. He turned to Mark before he went to the door and said quietly, "There are people outside. I think they followed your trail here. I need you to stay on the floor away from the windows and stay quiet." And Mark looked at him with eyes that had cleared fully now, eyes that were present and intelligent and completely without the self-deception that fear can produce in people who have not been in situations like this before, and said yes. And Daniel said good, and then he looked at Luna and said you. Stay with him, and she looked back at him with those dark eyes and moved to press herself against Mark's side, and Daniel went to the door and opened it and stepped out into the storm. What followed over the next 47 minutes was not a fight in any dramatic sense of that word and was not, when Daniel described it later to the deputies who came to take his statement, anything that required elaborate description, because the most effective responses to threat are also generally the least spectacular, and Daniel Cross was nothing if not effective, and he used the storm and the dark and the terrain around the cabin that he knew with the completeness of someone who had walked it in every season and every weather for 3 years, used the blowing snow that reduced visibility and the trees that provided cover and the specific angles around the cabin that his training had assessed and catalogued in the first month of living there, used all of it in the systematic patient way that an experienced operator uses environment as extension of capability rather than obstacle to it. And he used the cold itself, which was an adversary he shared equally with the 3 men outside but understood far more deeply than they did, understood in the way that you understand something you have chosen to live alongside rather than something you have simply encountered, and by the time the first gray suggestion of morning began to build in the eastern sky there were 3 men secured at the bottom of the track with their own equipment and going nowhere, and Daniel walked back through the snow to his cabin door and heard Luna's tail on the floorboards before he had it fully open and heard Mark's voice say from across the room, quietly, "Is it over?" And Daniel said yes, it's over, and sat down on the floor beside the stove and let his body feel for the first time everything it had been doing since 9:47 the previous evening. He called it in on the satellite phone at 6:22 in the morning, the call that brought first a dispatcher's professional skepticism and then, as the details accumulated in the call, a silence that spoke of someone reaching for something to write with and beginning to write quickly, and the dispatcher said stay put, we're sending people, and Daniel said that won't be a problem, and set the phone down and leaned his head back against the log wall and closed his eyes for the first time. Since he had found the paw prints on the trail, and the fire burned in the stove and the storm outside was finally diminishing, the wind dropping degree by degree, the white pressure on the windows easing. And Luna was asleep with her head on Mark's leg and Mark was watching the ceiling with the expression of someone processing a night that will require a long time to fully process, and the cabin was warm, and they were alive, and outside the mountain was doing what it always did regardless of what happened on its surface, which was continuing, indifferently and completely and without any particular acknowledgement of the human events that had played out in its forest and its storm, simply continuing as it had continued for 10,000 years before this night and would continue for 10,000 years after it. Here is part 2, pure narration, no headings, one flowing paragraph form, full length. The morning after the storm arrived the way mornings always arrive after the worst nights, not with drama or announcement but with a quiet and almost indifferent insistence, a slow gray lightning at the edges of the eastern peaks that had nothing theatrical about it and nothing that acknowledged what the hours before it had contained, just the ordinary mechanical turning of the earth presenting its face once more to the sun with the complete indifference of something that has been performing this same rotation for 4 billion years and has developed no particular emotional investment in whether any specific night on any specific mountain was survived or not survived, witnessed or not witnessed. And Daniel Cross sat on the floor of his cabin with his back against the base of the bunk and his legs stretched out straight in front of him on the wooden floor and his coffee going cold in the cup he had set beside him 20 minutes ago, and watched the light change in the window and let his body feel for the first time everything it had been too occupied to feel while the work was happening, felt it arrive in sequence the way physical cost always arrives in sequence once the adrenaline steps aside, the deep burning in his thighs from 4 kilometers of hauling through unpacked snow, the pull across both shoulders from the paracord harness, the specific complaint of his lower back which had opinions about the angle of effort it had been asked to sustain for 2 hours through a building storm, and the cold that had gone into his joints in the way that -15-degree cold goes into joints when the body has been working too hard to maintain its defenses against it, and none of it mattered in the particular way that physical cost stops mattering when the accounting is done and the outcome column shows the right result. Because across the room on the floor in front of the wood stove Mark Ellis was breathing in the slow steady rhythm of a man whose body temperature had returned to a viable range and whose system was doing the deep repair work of recovery rather than the desperate maintenance work of survival. And Luna was asleep across his legs with her chin on his knee and her own breathing slow and deep and complete, and the fire was burning. Low but burning, and outside the window the storm had spent itself entirely and the mountain was still. He sat with the stillness for a long time. He had learned to do this in the years on the mountain, had learned that stillness was not the absence of something but the presence of something, that it had texture and weight and content if you sat with it long enough to stop waiting for it to become something else, and on this particular morning the stillness had a quality he had not encountered before, a density that came from everything the night had passed through to arrive at it, and he sat in it and let it be what it was and did not try to name it or file it or arrive at any conclusion about it, because some things resist conclusion and are better served by simply being held, and this was one of those things. Luna made a small sound in her sleep, a low exhalation that was not distress but something closer to release, and Daniel looked at her and thought about the clearing again the way he had been thinking about it at intervals throughout the night, returning to it the way you return to a thing that has not yet given up all of what it contains, the image of her standing in the snow with the weight of it building on her back, the image that had been the beginning of everything that followed, and he understood now in the full light of what had happened since that the image was not just the beginning of a rescue operation but something larger than that, something that would take him a long time to fully process, and he was patient with the processing in a way that 3 years on the mountain had taught him to be patient, understanding that the things worth understanding do not yield themselves quickly and that the attempt to rush understanding produces only the illusion of it. Mark woke fully at 7:14 in the morning by the clock on the wall beside the door, woke in the complete way rather than the fragmentary half-conscious surfacing he had managed twice during the night, opened his eyes and lay still for a moment doing the necessary work of assembly, gathering the components of where he was and what had happened and how far the night had carried him from the ravine at the edge of the clearing to this floor in this cabin with this fire and this warmth, and the assembly took perhaps 40 seconds, and then his eyes moved and found Luna, and something in his face changed with the specific and complicated quality of a face encountering something it had genuinely not known whether it would encounter again. A quality that was relief and gratitude and love all operating simultaneously and that did not resolve into any single expression but simply existed as all three at once, and he said her name quietly, Luna, said it with the weight of everything the name had accumulated over 14 months of working and living and moving through wild places together, and she lifted her head from his knee and looked at him, and the dark eyes were fully open now, fully present, the exhaustion of the clearing replaced by something clear and awake and completely attending to the fact of him, and she made a sound that came from low in her chest and was not a bark and not a whine but something that existed in its own category, the sound of an animal completing a circuit that had been open for too long, and she pressed her nose against his hand and he closed his fingers around her muzzle gently and they stayed like that for a moment that Daniel, watching from across the room, understood was not for him to observe too closely, and he turned to the stove and busied himself with feeding it back to full strength. The broth that Daniel made from the stores in his cabin was not sophisticated but it was hot and it was salty and it was exactly what Mark's body needed, and he drank it slowly with both hands around the cup and the color came back into his face degree by degree as the warmth moved through him, and between sips he talked with the careful deliberateness of someone whose mind is still warming up alongside his body, whose thoughts are coming at a slightly reduced speed and are being checked for reliability before being released. And Daniel sat across from him and listened in the way he had learned to listen on long operations, completely and without impatience, letting the other person find their own pace and their own path through what they needed to say without inserting his own agenda into the space of their telling, and what Mark told him in that first hour of full consciousness filled in the details that the night had left incomplete, filled in the 3 months of field work and the discovery of the bait stations and the slow building of the evidential record and the growing awareness that he was being watched and the decision to stay and finish the documentation anyway, and the morning he was certain he had been seen, and the 3 days of the hunters moving closer, and finally the afternoon when they appeared on the trail behind him, and he had understood with the clarity of a body that has made its own assessment of a situation before the mind has finished processing it that the time for staying had passed and the time for leaving had arrived. And he talked about running through the trees in zero visibility, and he talked about the ravine appearing under his foot where there should have been ground, and he talked about the fall and the cold at the bottom of the ravine and the way the snow had come down while he lay there and the way his ability to move had diminished and then disappeared, and through all of it, through every moment of that account, Luna was the constant, Luna was the thread that ran through every part of it, present at the running and present at the fall and present at the bottom of the ravine and present through the hours of cold and diminishing consciousness, never leaving, never wavering, never making any of the calculations that a lesser loyalty would have made about the ratio of cost to benefit and the point at which withdrawal becomes the rational choice. And Mark said this without embellishment and without the kind of emotional performance that the story might have invited, because the facts themselves were sufficient. The facts were more than sufficient. The facts were so far beyond sufficient that any additional emotional weight would have been redundant, and Daniel listened to all of it and at the end of it said nothing for a moment and then said, "How long do you think she was with you before I found you?" And Mark looked at his cup and said, "I fell at approximately 4 in the afternoon, and you found us around 10 at night," and Daniel did the arithmetic and said, 6 hours, and Mark said, 6 hours, yes, at -15, alone, and neither of them said anything after that for a while because there was nothing useful to add to that number, and the silence around it was more honest than any words would have been. The deputies arrived at 7:43 and the paramedic Carla Reyes arrived with them, and she assessed Mark with the efficient thoroughness of someone who has been doing this work for 11 years and has learned that the assessments you skip are the ones that produce the complications you spend the next week managing. And she checked everything that needed to be checked and confirmed what Daniel's monitoring through the night had suggested, which was that Mark's core temperature had recovered to 36.1 degrees and his vitals were stable and his cognitive function was intact and his peripheral circulation was returning, and she said, "Hospital, this needs to be supervised for at least the next 24 hours, and Mark said, "I know." And the exchange had the quality of two people who have both done enough field work to know that arguing with a paramedic about whether you need medical supervision after severe hypothermia is not an argument worth having, and then Mark looked at Luna and Carla looked at Mark looking at Luna and said, "The dog comes," and the way she said it was the way you say something that you are prepared to defend if necessary but would prefer not to have to, and no one required her to defend it, and Luna rode to the hospital in the back of the snowcat beside Mark with her head on his leg and her eyes open and watchful the entire journey, watching the snow move past the windows, watching the mountain diminish behind them as they descended toward the road, watching everything with the attention of an animal that has recently learned that the world contains more danger than it previously accounted for and has updated its threat assessment accordingly. Deputy Harwell stayed at the cabin to take Daniel's statement, and Deputy Prentice went down to deal with the 3 men secured at the bottom of the track, and the statement took 45 minutes because there was a substantial amount of it, and Harwell was the kind of deputy who understood that thoroughness at the scene is an investment in the quality of everything that comes after. And Daniel gave him every detail in the sequence it had occurred: the paw prints in the snow and the dog in the clearing and the buried hand and the pulse and the sled constructed from pine saplings and paracord and the 4-kilometer pull through the storm and the sound in the trees at the frozen stream and the headlights at the bottom of the track and the 47 minutes that had produced 3 secured men and no fatalities. And Harwell wrote it all down in his neat, precise hand and asked his clarifying questions at the appropriate moments, and at the end of the account sat back and looked at Daniel across the table and said, "The dog helped you dig him out?" And Daniel said yes, and Harwell looked at his notes and said, "And then she guided you back to the cabin through the storm?" And Daniel said yes, and Harwell wrote something and was quiet for a moment and then said, "All right," and that was the entirety of his editorial response, which Daniel found appropriate and even admirable, the response of a man who understands that some things are best received without commentary. The 3 men at the bottom of the track were cooperative in the way that people become cooperative when they have spent several hours secured in -15-degree temperatures and are now being offered the prospect of a vehicle with heating. Cooperative meaning they talked, and what they said confirmed everything Mark had told Daniel about the operation and added details that the investigators would spend the following weeks verifying and expanding, and the names they provided and the locations they described and the logistics they outlined when properly questioned by the federal agents who arrived 2 days later constituted the beginning of the end of something that had been operating for 7 years across 3 states with the particular confidence of an enterprise that has learned that the places most remote from human oversight are also the places most remote from the consequences of operating without it. And that confidence had been its eventual undoing because the remoteness that made it invisible had also made it attractive to a wildlife researcher who needed exactly that remoteness for his work and who had the training and the patience to document what he found there with a thoroughness that the operations organizers had never anticipated from someone they had initially assessed as a non-threatening academic in expensive field gear. The federal investigators arrived on the 3rd day after the storm, 2 of them, a man named Garrett and a woman named Valdez. And they drove up the mountain road in a 4-wheel drive that showed the kind of wear that comes from regular use in rough country, and they carried themselves with the specific economy of people who do this work in many different places and have learned to adapt their approach to each new context before imposing anything on it. And they sat at Daniel's table and they drove out to the base camp site that Mark had described, and they recovered the waterproof hard case from beneath the false floor of the supply cache where Mark had hidden it. And what the case contained when they opened it on the table in Daniel's cabin was 3 months of documentation so thorough and so organized and so carefully cross-referenced that Valdez, who had been doing this work for 22 years, said quietly while paging through the photographic index that this was the most comprehensive field record she had seen of an operation of this type, said it without inflection and without the enthusiasm that would have made it a compliment rather than an assessment, said it as pure professional judgment. And Garrett looked up from the GPS data logs and said, "He did all of this while they were watching him," and Valdez said, "Apparently," and neither of them said anything else for a moment because the implications of that were sufficient to occupy the silence without elaboration. The case against the operation built quickly once the documentation was in federal hands, built the way cases build when the foundational work has been done comprehensively, and what remains is the investigative work of connecting what is known to what can be proven. And within 10 days of the night in the storm, the first arrests were made in the cities where the operations organizers lived their other lives, their lives that had nothing to do with mountains or forests or the systematic destruction of protected species in remote ranges, their lives of ordinary urban commerce and family dinners and neighborhood associations and all the other apparatus of people who exist without contradiction in 2 completely different moral universes simultaneously. And within 14 days 4 additional people had been taken into custody, and the operation's financial infrastructure had been identified and frozen, and the market connections that had made it profitable for 7 years had been severed one by one as the investigators followed the documentation that Mark Ellis had built through the worst winter in the mountain range in a decade, and within 3 weeks the whole edifice had come down completely and without the possibility of reconstruction, and the federal investigators sent a brief email to Mark at the hospital address they had been given, and the email said simply, "It's done." And Mark read it on his phone from the hospital bed where he was completing his supervised recovery, and showed it to Luna, who was lying beside him on the bed in violation of the hospital's stated policy regarding animals in patient rooms, a policy that Carla Reyes had apparently explained to the nursing staff in terms sufficiently compelling that no one had yet attempted to enforce it. And Luna read the screen with the serious attention she gave to everything Mark showed her, and then looked at him, and he looked back at her, and neither of them had anything to add to what the screen had said. He was discharged on the 4th morning, and he walked out of the hospital into the gray winter light of the parking lot, and Luna was in the back seat of Carla's truck with her nose pressed against the glass, and she saw him before he had fully oriented himself to the outside world. Saw him and began that full body trembling that is an animal's response to a reunion that exceeded its expectations. And Mark crossed the parking lot and opened the door, and she came out of it and pressed against him with her full weight, and he held her in the parking lot with the winter sky above them and the mountains visible to the north as a white line against the blue, and he did not try to make the moment into anything other than what it was, which was sufficient, which was more than sufficient, which was everything that the word homecoming has ever tried to mean, concentrated into a parking lot on a gray Thursday morning in February, with a German shepherd pressing her 68 pounds against a man who understood now in his body and his bones exactly what it meant that she was there to press against him. He went back to the city apartment, and the apartment was different with her in it, the way all spaces are different when something essential has been restored to them, more present, more complete. And he moved through the first days of recovery with the deliberate slowness that the hospital had prescribed and that his body confirmed was appropriate, resting and eating and sleeping more than he had slept in months, and letting the mountain and the storm and the cold recede from the foreground of his experience into the middle distance where they could be looked at rather than survived. And Luna moved through the apartment with him, always in the same room, always within touching distance, not with the anxious Velcro quality of a dog who has been traumatized into an inability to tolerate separation, but with the calm, steady proximity of an animal that has made a considered decision about how close it intends to remain and is at peace with that decision. And Mark watched her and thought about the clearing, and thought about the 6 hours at -15, and thought about the fact that every morning he had woken up since the fall had been a morning that existed because of a decision she had made in a ravine in the dark, and held to through every hour of cold and diminishing hope. And the thinking about this did not diminish with time or repetition, but deepened, the way thinking about something truly large deepens the longer you stay with it, because the true size of things reveals itself slowly, and the mind needs time and quiet to take the full measure of what it has been given. He wrote the field report for the university first because the university had been patient for long enough, and because the field report was the professional obligation, and professional obligations are the ones you discharge before the personal ones when you have the discipline that fieldwork develops in a person. And the field report was thorough and factual, and documented the 3 months of research in the terms that the academic context required, the wolf pack movement data and the habitat assessment and the ecological survey results. And in the appendix he included a note about the illegal hunting operation and referred the reader to the federal investigation for the detailed record, a note that was itself factual and dispassionate, and that gave no indication of what the 3 months had cost or what the last night of them had required. And he submitted it to the department head with a covering email that was equally factual and equally dispassionate, and that generated a response from the department head that was warm and relieved, and that included a sentence which read, "I am very glad you are all right, Mark." And that sentence, in the context of everything else, was enough, was exactly the right amount of institutional acknowledgement. Then he wrote the letter to Daniel Cross. He wrote it over 2 evenings, not because the writing was difficult, but because the thinking required for it was thorough, and he wanted to do the thinking properly before he committed any of it to words, wanted to arrive at what was actually true rather than what was easy to say. And what he arrived at over the 2 evenings of thinking and the 2 evenings of writing was a letter that began with gratitude and moved through memory and arrived somewhere he had not anticipated when he started, arrived at a set of thoughts about loyalty and love and the nature of commitment that surprised him with their clarity, and that he included in the letter because one of the things that 3 months of solitary fieldwork develops in a person is the habit of saying the thing you actually think rather than a safer approximation of it, And he said in the letter what he had come to understand about what Luna had done, said it as directly as he could, said that what she had done was not a performance of loyalty or an expression of training or an instinctive response to a situation her biology had prepared her for, but something that he could only describe as a choice, a fully conscious and continuously renewed choice, made in the first moment after his fall and remade in every subsequent moment through 6 hours of cold and dark and diminishing physical capacity, the choice to stay, the choice that was not a single decision but 1,000 consecutive decisions, each of which could have gone the other way and none of which did, and he said that he believed this was the closest thing to the purest form of love that he had personally witnessed, not the love that is warm and comfortable and costs nothing to maintain, but the love that is cold and dark and costs everything and is maintained anyway, maintained past the point of comfort and past the point of reason and past the point where any external observer could reasonably expect it to continue, maintained simply because the thing it is directed toward is there and is in need and no other reason is required. Daniel read the letter on a Tuesday morning in late February, standing at the window of his cabin with the mountain outside white and clear and the sky above it the hard bright blue of high winter and the coffee in his hand hot enough to warm his palm through the ceramic, and he read it once through at normal reading speed and then he read the paragraph about love again at a slower speed and then he folded the letter carefully along its original creases and held it for a moment and thought about the clearing and thought about Luna's eyes when she looked at him before stepping aside and thought about the specific quality of that two-step movement, the way it had contained within it such a complete and immediate trust, and he thought that Mark had found the right words for it, had found words that were more precise than any he himself would have managed. And he put the letter in the box under the bunk with the medical kit and the other things he kept there that mattered, and then he stood at the window for a long time with his coffee growing cold again and the mountain outside doing what the mountain always did, which was being there, and he let the being there of it do what it did, which was remind him that the world was very large and very old and contained things that were not reducible to any system he had been trained in, and that this was not a problem to be solved but a fact to be appreciated. And he appreciated it in the quiet way of someone who has learned that appreciation does not require expression to be real. The State Wildlife Authority held a formal event in March to recognize the work that had resulted in the dismantling of the operation. A small ceremony in a conference room in the regional office with a handful of officials and investigators and the two federal agents Garrett and Valdez and Mark in a jacket that was cleaner than anything he usually wore in the field and Luna sitting beside his chair with the dignified composure of an animal that has been to enough field briefings to find the conference room environment unremarkable. And the authority's director said some things about the importance of the work and the quality of the documentation and the significance of the outcome and presented Mark with a formal letter of commendation and presented Luna with a certificate that the director's assistant had printed on heavy cream paper with a gold border and that cited Luna by name and described her contribution to the preservation of protected wildlife species in terms that were accurate, and that would have been entirely unremarkable if you had not known the specific night those terms were referring to, and someone took a photograph of Mark and Luna at the table with the certificate, and Luna looked at the camera with the same serious attentive expression she brought to everything, and the photograph was the one that the regional newspaper ran with its story the following week under a headline that Mark found slightly embarrassing and Luna appeared entirely indifferent. The newspaper story was picked up by a national outlet on the third day after it ran in the regional paper. Picked up and expanded with additional reporting that included a phone interview with Carla Reyes and a quoted passage from the federal investigation's press release and a description of the operation's scope and duration that put the individual night of the storm in the context of the larger story it had contributed to ending, and the national story was picked up by 3 international outlets on the day after that. And for approximately 11 days Luna was famous in the specific way that animals become famous when they do something that cuts through the noise of the information environment and touches something that people recognize as true and important even when they cannot immediately articulate why. Something about fidelity and about the nature of loyalty and about what it looks like when a living thing gives everything it has for another living thing without calculation and without reservation and without the safety net of knowing that the giving will be sufficient, and the comments sections beneath the stories were full of people saying things about their own dogs and their own experiences of animal loyalty and their own understanding of what the word faithful actually means when you strip it of its metaphorical uses and return it to its original and most literal sense, which is simply full of faith, which is simply believing in the thing you are committed to even when the evidence for the belief is thin, which is what Luna had done in the ravine in the dark and the cold for 6 hours while the evidence for the belief that anyone would come was precisely zero and the belief was maintained regardless. And then the news cycle moved on the way it always does and the stories dropped from the front pages and the comments sections went quiet and Luna went back to being a German shepherd in a second-floor apartment who pressed her nose against the glass on cold mornings and watched the street below with professional interest. Mark returned to his fieldwork in the spring. The university had offered him a new project, a summer and fall survey of elk corridor usage in a different mountain range 300 kilometers to the east, a range he had not worked in before and that offered the particular pleasure of new terrain, new habitat, new patterns to learn and document. And he had accepted it without the hesitation that might have been understandable in someone who had recently survived the winter he had survived. Accepted it because the work was the work and the work was what he was. And he packed his gear in the apartment over 3 days in April with Luna watching the packing with the alert attention of an animal who has learned to read the specific signs of an imminent departure for the field and who regards those signs with unambiguous enthusiasm. The enthusiasm of a working dog who has been in an apartment for too long and is ready to return to the environment for which her body and her mind were designed. And on the 4th morning Mark loaded the truck and drove east and Luna rode in the back seat with the window cracked and her nose working the incoming air with the focused intensity of someone reading a text in a language that only they can see. The new range was gentler than the winter range, lower in elevation, less severe in its weather, and the summer fieldwork had the quality that Mark's best fieldwork always had, the quality of being fully inside the world you are studying, moving through it at its own pace, learning its rhythms and its grammar. And Luna worked beside him with the seamless proficiency of a partner who has been doing this long enough that the coordination between them requires no conscious negotiation, each of them knowing what the other will do before the other does it, each of them reading the landscape and the weather and the animal sign with a combined attention that was greater than either of them had alone, and the days in the field were long and full and real in the way that days in the field are real when the work is good and the terrain is honest and the company is exactly right. And at the end of each day when they made camp and Mark wrote up his notes and Luna ate and then pressed herself against his side in the tent for the warmth and the contact, he thought sometimes about the winter range and the storm and the clearing, and the thinking about it had changed quality since the letter to Daniel Cross, had become less a replaying of the event and more a carrying of it, a carrying in the way you carry something that has become part of your understanding of the world rather than just a memory of something that happened in it. He called Daniel in June. The first time they had spoken since the night itself, called him on a clear evening from a ridge above the camp with the summer range spread out below him in the long golden light and Luna sitting beside him watching a hawk work the thermals above the valley with the particular focused attention she reserved for birds she considered interesting. And Daniel answered on the 3rd ring in the unhurried way of someone who has been near the phone without being distracted by it, and they talked for 40 minutes. Talked about the spring and the new fieldwork and the progress of the federal case and the departure of winter from the mountain and the things that had grown back in the clearing, and they talked about Luna, and Mark described the parking lot reunion and Daniel listened to it with the quality of attention that the story deserved, and then there was a moment of quiet between them that was not uncomfortable but full, the quiet of two people who have been through something together and do not need to narrate the having been through it in order to acknowledge it, and then Daniel said, "I think about her in the clearing," and Mark said, "I know, I do too," and Daniel said, "I don't think I'll stop," and Mark said, "No, I don't think so either," and that was the extent of the direct acknowledgement and it was enough, it was exactly enough, and after they hung up Daniel stood at the window of his cabin for a while, and the mountain was lit gold from the west. And the shadows of the trees were long across the snow that still lay in the north-facing hollows and the evening was very quiet and very clear and he felt something that he had been feeling at intervals since February, a feeling he had been learning the shape of the way you learn the shape of something in the dark, by moving around it carefully with your hands, and he thought he was beginning to know what it was, beginning to know its name. The summer passed the way summers pass in the mountains, in a long, slow gold and green exhale that feels endless while it is happening and impossibly brief when you look back at it from the other side. And Daniel moved through it the way he moved through all the seasons, with the deliberate attention of someone who has decided that the life he is living is worth the attention he is giving it, checking the traps and maintaining the cabin and walking the trails in the long evenings and sitting on the porch in the early mornings with coffee and the specific quality of mountain air in June and July and August that is nothing like the air at any other time of year, and the clearing was always there in his mind at some level, not insistently, not in the way of something that demands to be thought about, but present the way significant things are present in a life that has received them, available when the attention turned toward it, yielding something new each time it was examined. And what it yielded most consistently when he examined it was the image of the two-step movement, Luna stepping aside to let him dig, and the more he looked at that image the more it contained, the more it seemed to him to be a complete statement about something that the rest of the night had been the elaboration of, a statement about the nature of trust and the conditions under which trust is extended and what it means when trust is extended in exactly the circumstances where its extension costs the most. In August, Daniel drove down the mountain for the first time in 6 weeks, drove into town for supplies and for the particular pleasure of a meal he had not cooked himself, and he sat at the counter of the diner on the main street and ate eggs and read the regional newspaper that lived on the counter beside the coffee pot. And on the third page of the paper he found a short follow-up story about the wildlife trafficking prosecution, a story about the sentencing hearing that had taken place the previous week. And he read it with the careful attention he gave to anything related to that night, read the sentences and the terms and the formal language of legal consequence being applied to 7 years of systematic destruction, and he felt something that was not exactly satisfaction because satisfaction implies that the outcome has repaired the damage and the damage was not reparable, the mountain lions that had been killed and the wolverines that had been taken and the years of population decline that would take a generation of conservation effort to begin reversing were not things that sentences in a court of law could undo, and he knew this and the knowing of it complicated the feeling, but there was something alongside the complication that was simpler and cleaner, something that was just the plain acknowledgement that the thing had been stopped, that it had been running for 7 years and it had been stopped. And the stopping of it was connected in a direct and traceable line back to a dog in a clearing and a man who had stayed and a night that had been everything it needed to be in order for the stopping to happen, and that was worth something, that was worth the plain acknowledgement of being worth something, and he finished his eggs and left a good tip and drove back up the mountain in the late afternoon with the supplies in the bed of the truck and the long light on the peaks and the air coming through the open window full of pine and distance and the particular smell of high country in late summer that he thought was the closest thing to a physical description of the word home that he had ever encountered. The fall arrived and with it the first cold, the tentative advance cold of September that suggests rather than insists and that has none of the commitment of the winter cold that would follow it, and Daniel put the cabin in order for the coming season the way he did every fall, methodically and without haste, and checked the wood supply and augmented it and went through the medical kit and restocked what had been used. And when he opened the kit he thought about the heat packs and the space sack and the emergency blanket and what they had been called on to do in February, and he thought that the kit had earned its 3 years of occupying the space under the bunk, had justified every restocking and every annual review. And he replaced what was depleted and added some items he had identified during the night as gaps in the inventory and closed the box and put it back and stood for a moment in the quiet of the cabin with the afternoon light coming through the window and the early fall settling into the trees outside, and he thought, next winter, and whatever next winter held, he was ready for it. Mark sent another email in October, this one longer than the single line of June, and it described the completion of the summer fieldwork and the return to the city and the writing up of the survey results and the conversation he had had with the department head about the following year's projects. And at the end of the professional update there was a personal section that began, "I have been thinking about something I want to ask you," and what he wanted to ask was whether Daniel had ever considered leaving the mountain, not permanently, not as an abandonment of the project he was engaged in there, but temporarily, for the kind of visit that two people make when they have been through something together and have only ever talked about it from a distance and want once to talk about it in the same room. And he said, "Luna would like to see the cabin, I think. She has strong opinions about places she has been and even stronger ones about places she hasn't been yet but probably should be, And Daniel read this and read it again and then sat for a while at his table with the lamp on and the dark outside and the fire in the stove and thought about what it would mean to have that, to have the man and the dog back on the mountain in the spring when the snow was receding and the air was changing and the clearing would be green again. And then he typed back a response that said, "Spring, come in the spring," and sent it before he changed his mind, and then sat for a moment with the sent message and the fire and the dark and felt something shift very slightly in the architecture of the life he had been building on the mountain, shift in the way that the addition of one element to a structure shifts the entire structure, not destabilizing it but completing it in a way that reveals a gap you had not known was there until the gap is filled. The winter came in November that year, came earlier and harder than the previous year, came with the full commitment of a season that has no interest in transition, and Daniel moved through it with the established competence of someone for whom winter is not an adversary but a condition, managing the cabin and the trails and the cold with the quiet mastery of 3 years of practice. And the mountain in winter was the mountain at its most itself, stripped of everything decorative and supplementary, reduced to its essential character, which was immense and cold and indifferent and completely, breathtakingly beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they are entirely what they are without apology or mitigation, and Daniel moved through that beauty with the specific appreciation of someone who has chosen to live inside it rather than observe it from a distance. And the nights were long and the cold was serious and the silence was the silence of a world that has reduced itself to its fundamentals, and he was at home in it, genuinely and without performance at home in it, and he knew this not as a conclusion he had arrived at intellectually but as a fact he experienced physically every morning when he opened the cabin door and stepped into the cold air and looked at the mountain and thought, yes, still right, still the right place, still the right project. He went to the clearing once in December, went deliberately, retracing the trail he had walked that night in the dark at -15, walking it now in the cold afternoon light of a December day that was clear and still and about -8, cold but not searingly cold, the mountain in one of its gentler moods, and the trail was familiar to him as only a trail you have walked hundreds of times can be familiar, familiar in the body as well as the mind, his feet knowing where to place themselves before his eyes had confirmed the placement, and the clearing appeared through the last stand of pines the way it had appeared on that night, the opening in the trees, the white expanse, and he walked into it and stood in the center of it and looked at the ground beneath his feet, the ground that in February had been the site of everything, and it looked like nothing now, looked like every other square meter of snow-covered mountain clearing, no mark, no sign, no physical record of what had happened here in the storm 9 months ago, and this was appropriate, this was as it should be. The mountain keeps none of the records of the human events that occur on its surface, maintains no registry of the moments of crisis and heroism and love and survival that take place in its forests and its clearings and its ravines, leaves all of that to the people and the animals who were present. And Daniel stood in the clearing and held all of it, held the full memory of it in the way you hold something you do not intend to put down, and then he turned and walked back through the pines toward the cabin, and the afternoon light was long and gold on the snow, and the mountain was quiet around him, and he thought, in the spring. January was the coldest month. It was often the coldest month in the high range, the month when the winter stopped building toward its peak and simply occupied it, and Daniel spent it in the close economy of severe cold, conserving heat and effort with the practiced efficiency of someone who has learned that survival in genuine cold is not a dramatic business but a managerial one, a series of small correct decisions made consistently over time. And the cabin was warm and the wood supply was adequate and the stores were sufficient and the mountain outside was doing what it did in January, which was being absolute, and he was inside it and managing it and it was fine, it was what he had chosen and it was fine. And in the evenings he read and thought and occasionally wrote in the journal he had kept since coming to the mountain, and what he wrote in January was often about the clearing, was often an attempt to articulate something about that night that he had not yet fully articulated, approaching it from new angles, trying new words for the things the available words did not quite fit, and what he kept returning to, what the journal kept returning to regardless of what angle he approached from, was the question of what it means to stay, what it means specifically, what the full content of that act is when it is performed by a living creature in the most extreme version of the circumstances that make staying difficult, And he wrote around this question for many pages and from many directions, and what he arrived at, slowly and imprecisely but arriving nonetheless, was something like this. Staying is an argument. Staying is the purest argument available to a living thing, the argument made. Not with words or with evidence or with any of the instruments of persuasion that language provides, but with the body itself, with the simple physical fact of continued presence, and the argument says, this matters, this person or this place or this moment matters, it matters enough that I am here, I am still here, I am here and I will remain here, and my remaining is the entirety of what I have to offer, and I offer it completely, and the argument that Luna made in the clearing was this argument. In its most complete and most costly form, the argument made with every resource available, physical and instinctive, and whatever the third thing is that exists in an animal capable of 6 hours of commitment in -15 degrees without any external reinforcement of the commitment. And he did not have a word for the third thing, but he knew it was real, and he knew it was the most important part of the argument, and he knew that he had been changed by witnessing it in a way that was still revealing itself to him, still sending up new aspects of the change as the months accumulated. February came, and with it the anniversary of the night of the storm, and Daniel woke on the morning of the anniversary and lay in his bunk for a few minutes before getting up and thought about the year that had passed and what it had contained and what he understood now that he had not understood when the year began, and what he understood was considerable and what remained unclear was also considerable, and he thought that this ratio, more understood than a year ago but still substantial, portions of the unclear remaining, was probably the correct ratio for a life being lived with genuine attention, and he got up and made coffee and stood at the window and looked at the mountain in the anniversary light, the same mountain, the same window, the same early morning quiet, and he thought about the clearing and thought about Luna and thought about Mark and thought about the letter and thought about spring, and then he went outside to check the traps, and the cold was still serious, but had in it the first barely perceptible suggestion of something that was not yet warmth but was the absence of the most extreme cold, the suggestion of the season's eventual turn, and he noticed it the way you notice things when you live in close enough contact with a place to read its subtlest signals, and he thought, not long now, and went about the morning. The spring came in March that year, came earlier than expected and with more conviction than usual, and the snow began its recession up the slopes with a speed that surprised even Daniel, who had been watching this particular mountain make this particular transition for 3 years, and the clearing was green by the 3rd week of April, green with the new growth that comes up through the receding snow with the urgency of something that has been waiting a long time and intends to make the most of the season available to it, small plants and new grass and the early wildflowers that are the mountain's first argument against the winter that has just released it. And Daniel walked to the clearing in late April and stood in the green center of it and thought about December when it had been white and thought about February of the previous year when it had been the site of everything. And the green was thick and real under his boots, and the air was cold but soft with the softness of spring. Cold, and he thought that the mountain had done what it always did, which was continue, which was renew, which was offer the green argument against everything the winter had said. Mark arrived in the 2nd week of May. He drove up the mountain road in the truck that showed 3 seasons of field work since Daniel had last seen it, and he parked at the end of the track below the cabin, and he got out and Luna got out of the back seat and she stood in the mountain air and lifted her nose and worked the air with the total absorption of an animal encountering a landscape that is both new and known, new in the specific details of this place and known in the general grammar of mountain and pine and cold water and the particular complexity of a high-altitude spring morning. And she looked around with those dark intelligent eyes and then looked at Mark and then looked back at the mountain with an expression that was as close to recognition as an animal's face can express, the expression of something arriving somewhere it has been before in some version, and Mark looked at the cabin and looked at the trail and looked at Daniel, who was standing at the cabin door, and said, "So this is it," and Daniel said, "This is it." And Luna was already moving up the trail toward the clearing with the purposeful stride of a dog who has made a navigational decision and does not require input on it. They followed her. They walked up the trail together in the May morning with the light coming through the new leaves of the deciduous trees that grew at the lower elevation and the smell of the pines above them and the sound of the creek below, and Luna moved ahead of them with her nose working and her ears moving and her tail in the easy horizontal carry of a dog engaged with the world around her and pleased to be engaged with it, And Daniel and Mark walked behind her and talked in the way of people who have been corresponding for months and are now adjusting to the fuller bandwidth of physical presence, filling in the details that letters and phone calls cannot carry, and the conversation moved easily through the new fieldwork and the prosecution outcomes and the state of the mountain in spring and the state of the city in winter and the things each of them had been thinking about and had not quite found the words for in correspondence. And the trail climbed through the pines and the morning deepened around them, and ahead of them Luna stopped at the edge of the clearing and turned to look back at them and waited. They came up beside her, and the three of them stood at the edge of the clearing together and looked at the green center of it, the new growth and the early flowers and the particular quality of a mountain clearing in May morning light. And Daniel said nothing and Mark said nothing, and Luna stood between them and looked at the ground in the center of the clearing, not with the focused, desperate attention of the previous February, but with something quieter, something that was not urgency but its opposite, something that was completion. And after a moment she walked forward into the clearing and lowered her nose to the grass and moved in a slow circle around the center of it, reading whatever was there to be read, and then she raised her head and looked at Mark, and her tail moved in the slow broad sweep that Daniel recognized from the night in the clearing when she had stepped aside to let him dig, the movement that communicated something, the specific word for which he had been learning all year, and he thought that this was it, this was the closest he was going to get to the name for the thing that had no name, this moment. These three living things in a green clearing on a May morning with the mountain around them and the year behind them and everything that the year had carried, and he thought, yes, this is the word, this is what the word is, this is what all the words are trying to say when they say loyalty and love and faith and fidelity and devotion. They are trying to say this specific thing, this living creature in this clearing choosing with her whole body to be here and to be well and to have stayed, and the staying being everything, and the everything being enough. They stood in the clearing for a long time. The morning moved around them, and the light shifted in the trees, and a bird called somewhere in the pines above, and Luna eventually went to the edge of the clearing and lay down in the new grass with her chin on her paws and watched the two men with the calm proprietary attention of an animal that is exactly where it intends to be. And Daniel and Mark talked for a while longer and then went quiet and let the mountain be around them, and the quiet was the kind of quiet that you can only be inside when you are with someone you do not need to fill it for. And they stood in it together, and Daniel thought about the year and thought about what the year had given him and thought about what it means to live alone in a place and to have the aloneness interrupted in exactly the right way at exactly the right moment by exactly the right people, the man and the dog who had come into his clearing and his night and his life and changed the configuration of it in ways he was still discovering. And he thought that this was the thing he had not been able to name all year. This was the feeling he had been learning the shape of in the dark. This was what the mountain had been keeping for him in the clearing all winter under the snow and had given back to him in the spring in the form of new green and a German shepherd lying in the grass with her chin on her paws, watching him with those dark eyes that contained everything they had always contained and always would. The afternoon came and they went back to the cabin and Daniel made food and they sat at the table and ate and talked until the evening came and the fire was necessary and the light outside the window was the long gold of May evening on a mountain that has finally, after a long winter, decided to be warm. And Luna slept by the stove with the absolute commitment of an animal that has assessed the available sleeping locations and found this one to be optimal. And the cabin held the three of them in the easy way of a place that has been alone for a while and is not displeased to be otherwise for a change. And Daniel thought, this is what the year was for, this is what the clearing was for, this is what the -15 and the sled and the 47 minutes in the dark were for, not the dramatic version of it, not the rescue as a story to be told, but the ordinary version, the version that looks like three living things in a warm cabin on a May evening with food and fire and the mountain outside and nothing required of any of them except to be present, which they all were, which they completely and entirely were. And outside the window the mountain continued in its indifferent and magnificent way, the peaks still white against the darkening sky, the forest below them settling into the sounds of evening, the creek talking to itself in the dark below the cabin, and the clearing 400 meters up the trail empty and green and holding nothing now except the memory of what it had held. And the memory was sufficient. The memory was more than sufficient. The memory was the thing that would outlast everything else about that February night, outlast the storm and the cold and the fear and the pain and the danger, outlast the legal proceedings and the news stories and the formal commendations, outlast even the people who carried it and would eventually be carried only in the broad anonymous way that important things are carried by the world after the people who knew them firsthand are gone, carried in the understanding that lives are saved sometimes by the most fundamental acts available to a living thing, acts that require no technology and no training and no exceptional courage in the Hollywood sense of that word, but only the oldest and most difficult and most complete thing, which is the decision to stay, the decision renewed in every moment, the decision that looks from the outside like stillness but is from the inside like the most strenuous possible effort, the effort of an animal who has made a commitment and is keeping it regardless, who is keeping it in the dark and the cold and the silence with no witness and no reward and no certainty of outcome, keeping it simply because the thing it is directed toward is there and is in need, and no other reason is necessary. Luna kept it. Luna kept it for 6 hours. And because she kept it, a man was alive to write a letter about it, and because the letter was written, a man on a mountain understood something he had been trying to understand for a year, and because he understood it, the clearing in the spring was not just a clearing but a completion, and because it was a completion, everything the winter had cost was paid, was more than paid, was transformed by the payment into something that had no name but that everyone who has ever stayed when they could have left will recognize immediately, will recognize in their body before their mind has had a chance to process it, will recognize as the truest thing they know. The fire burned. The mountain held. The dogs slept. And in the morning the light came back over the eastern peaks the way it always came, indifferent and reliable and entirely sufficient, and the world began again.